Okay, you've been asking a lot of questions lately, and I think it's about time that we have the talk. And you're probably going to want to sit down for this. We're going to talk about where bikes come from, more specifically, electric bikes. Now, this topic of where products are made is a pretty hot one in most industries. Most people are wondering where something's made to maybe have some idea of what the quality might be. If it's made in a particular country, might be more likely to have higher quality than others. But I don't know if this is as much of the case as it once was, as we're seeing technology improve more and more with manufacturing, as more of these things are becoming automated. At that point, does it actually matter where it is? It's actually just a matter of actually having the technology and having somebody that's competent to be able to manage it and create some of those systems. But just overall, for electric bikes, you'll find them manufactured from a variety of different places. Probably the largest manufacturer in the world, or the largest country manufacturing electric bikes in the world, would certainly be China at this point. But second to that, I don't really have the specific statistics on it, but just from what I've seen, it's probably going to be Taiwan. We're seeing more and more stuff moving to Vietnam. You definitely have a decent manufacturing base in Europe, and that's growing more and more. But if you peel back the curtain a little bit, you'll see that it's actually not as simple as that. Because even though you might have manufacturers in these different places, a lot of times the parts are sourced from the same places. Say Shimano, for example, which is a very common parts manufacturer. They're in Japan, so most of the parts are coming from there. So if you're going to build a bike in the US or wherever you're going to build it, and you're going to use Shimano brakes or derailleur, cassette, etc., then could it really technically be a full US made bike? It's a little bit tricky. I think that that's something that people don't always necessarily understand or think about. But if you think a bit deeper on that topic, you can recognize that most products have a global supply chain, and they're getting parts from many different places. Like, for example, we work with Bosch quite a bit, and their parts come from many different places. They're primarily manufactured in Europe. They make their batteries there. They make the motors there. Some of the electronics are made in China. As with most electronics these days, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you're seeing more and more of that stuff coming to the U.S., and this idea of reshoring manufacturing is becoming more and more viable and possible as the automation and robotics and different things becomes more viable, partly because of labor costs, partly because of just the investment that has already happened in other places. It's difficult for companies to be competitive. And I think if you dive a little bit deeper into the bike industry, into the electric bike industry, you'll see that's a lot of where it comes from. Just these long-term investments that many companies have put into this, really the infrastructure that gets built up around that. For example, I got to visit Taiwan 4 or 5 years ago. During that trip, I got to visit a lot of different manufacturers. I visited some frame manufacturers. I visited some assemblers. Oftentimes, you have one manufacturer building bikes for many different OEMs. Like, that happens for the traditional bike world. It also happens for the electric bike world. Then it's really up to the manufacturer where they want to have these bikes assembled. Sometimes they'll have them assembled in Asia. Sometimes they'll have them assembled in Europe, in the US, or whatever the case may be. I guess that's just a decision that they make, and whether it's a matter of quality control or it could be just a price thing. Oftentimes the labor costs could be different in different countries. Also, you can find different regulations, that sort of stuff. So all these things kind of come into play. But one thing I see that's often misunderstood about these concepts is just the ability for somebody just to create their own manufacturing, actually build every part of the bike. That's a very challenging thing to do, and based on my experience, it's not that likely that somebody's just going to come along and do that. I think many manufacturers would love to. I think many people would love that opportunity, but just the reality of it is to create all the tooling and everything else that's required to make some of these more intricate, smaller parts and test them over time and get something that actually works well is not so easy. I mean, if you think of like the car manufacturing world, a lot of times these different companies, they share different ideas and this and that. And it's pretty rare that you have a new manufacturer come along and just do everything from scratch. I think Tesla is an anomaly in this. And I know there's been some rumors about Tesla making an electric bike. Apparently at this time, they haven't said that they're going to do anything. They probably recognize that although a electric bike in some ways seems like a relatively simple thing to manufacture, the reality is it's not. And the opportunity cost of investing in all the tooling and everything like that, it's not always the easiest thing to do. And really, from my side, if I was to manufacture a bicycle or electric bicycle, I'd be looking to who are the partners that I can work with to actually manufacture a finished good that's going to be as high a quality as possible to meet the certain market segment, meet the requirements of my customer. And at the moment, you have different manufacturers for different components that are at the top of the game, and they're really spread throughout the world. For example, if you want the best frames manufactured anywhere, you're probably going to be looking at Taiwan. There are manufacturers in the US that do smaller scale stuff, and they could do really high quality stuff. But the reality is, to do frame manufacturing on a large scale, you generally need a pretty significant investment. That means that you generally need to have some scale or some proof of market. I think that that's a challenging thing. I think with most of these things, it's like the chicken or the egg sort of scenario. And it's like, can you build up this manufacturing and not necessarily know that you have the customer base or the volume or demand to actually warrant that investment? And I guess that's where the government comes in to some extent. And you say, okay, well, if you're going to put tariffs on stuff and I'm not going to be subject to these tariffs, then it can be more, cost effective and more advantageous for me to invest in these sort of things. All that being said, can you actually manufacture every portion of the bike? That can be very challenging. I think there are certain things that logically it would make sense if you wanted to really fully take on manufacturing to start out, and that would generally be the frame, probably. That's definitely one of the more complex parts of a bicycle. It's really the most critical part of the bicycle, right? Everything is kind of built and hung on the frame, if you will. But then you get into things like batteries. There's very few companies that are making batteries in the US, or at least that can actually be used for electric bikes or be used safely. I mean, sure, people can make them in the garage, and at the moment there's actually no one telling them they can't. That's a whole nother topic for another time. But really, if you wanted a very good battery, you'd likely be going to one of the major manufacturers for those sort of things. And most of them at the moment are in Asia, with some exceptions. Outside of that, you're looking at some of the other, individual components. I talked about Shimano for brakes and that sort of thing, but you also have like Tektro is another really large brake manufacturer in Taiwan. Magura is a brake manufacturer they're seeing more and more, and they're based in Germany. Most tires are coming out of Asia. There are several manufacturers in Germany that are doing tires as well. You have Continental is there, as well as Schwabe. And you have other parts like the drivetrain. Shimano makes a lot of the drivetrains, and they're made primarily in Japan, but they use sourcing from other places as well. Then you have the roll-off hub, which is made in Germany, but with the electronic shifting, as with most electronics, is primarily made in Asia. I guess when it comes to bike manufacturing, you could actually think of it pretty similar to the electronic side of things, where you have a lot of dependencies. So if you go to China, for example, they have a lot of these manufacturing places that depend on each other. One's making the microchip, and one's making the semiconductor, and one's making the capacitors, and they can all work together, and it's easy to trade between each other, and they're not like, okay, we're going to ship this here and ship this here. They're working in a relatively close area, and it makes it a lot easier, and it makes it easier for, them to make that investment. It also, generally speaking, takes some help from the government. There has been some discussion previously in the U.S. about Kent bicycles, trying to get something going here. Now, for those of you who don't know Kent Bicycles, their largest customer is Walmart, and Walmart technically is the largest retailer for bicycles in the U.S. They have been pushing to get manufacturing going in the U.S. From their side, they kind of need support from the government, because right now there's a lot of incentives for imports. There has recently been some disincentives to import from China, including a 25% tariff, which historically there's been no tariffs or duties assessed on electric bikes. Currently, Kent Bicycles is doing assembly in the US. Then you also have Detroit Bicycles that is doing assembly in the US as well. They've also assembled a lot of the bike share bikes for City Bike in New York City. And so you have this thing growing up that, maybe eventually there might be the possibility of something larger scale. You see other manufacturers that claim to be made in the US. And oftentimes these are made in the US of global components. But I'd be interested to know what you think. Is that something that impacts your purchasing decision, whether it's made in the US or made in another country that they might trust more for quality. I think as with most things, it's just not that simple, especially these days. But from my perspective, it really comes down to the brands that are manufacturing those products and how they manage that supply chain and how they manage that process. If you look at a lot of the leading electronics companies in the world, they're oftentimes manufacturing things in Asia, but they manage the whole process. Not to say that people in Asia can't do that on their own, but it's really about how a brand presents itself and their commitment to quality and their commitment to certain standards, for example. Historically, that's been one of the challenges is like labor, for example. People are not being treated properly, they're not being paid properly. Are they going to actually be able to put the energy into managing the quality on a level that we expect or we want? And I think that's sometimes where people look to different areas. The manufacturer is going to be better because people are treated better, etc. And just talking about, some of the manufacturers that we work with a lot of brands from all over the world. At the moment, we technically work with one brand that's an American brand, which is Benno Bikes. And it's kind of interesting because it's an American brand, but Benno's not originally American. He's Swiss, but lived in Germany. It's kind of like in between, but he lives in California and has for many years now, and he started the brand in California. He started his former brand, Electra Bikes, in California as well, but his bikes are primarily made in Taiwan. And then we work with Turn Bicycles. Their bikes are primarily made in Taiwan. It's a Taiwanese company, actually, but they have offices all over the globe, and they have customers all over the globe. We also work with many brands from Europe. So Reese & Mueller is a big brand that we work with that are technically, I guess, built in Germany. We actually made a video about their build process, but they source parts from all over as well. They have their frames manufactured in a variety of different places. Increasingly, they've been manufacturing some of their frames in Portugal, and so I guess they're getting more into that like completely European-made perspective. Another company we work with is Gazelle. That's a Dutch brand, and they actually build their bikes in the Netherlands, and they do a lot of the manufacturing process there, but their frames are made outside of the Netherlands. I think you're starting to see a theme here, the frames. Now, this is one of the more complex things to manufacture on a bicycle, and there's really a smaller number of manufacturers that are capable of doing it to the standards that we might expect, that we want. To some extent, if it's going to be tested, that's going to pass the adequate tests and that sort of thing. Because generally speaking, they have special machinery to do that. They have what's called frame jigs. So they basically set these up to put the frame in place. They can weld the frame in a variety of different ways. Some places do it by hand. Now we're seeing more and more companies go into robotic welding. There's a lot of these shifts that are happening in the industry, and some of that changes where it's possible for things to be manufactured. It really all depends. But for the most part, we're going based on something that happened probably 30, 40 plus years ago, where a lot of manufacturing moved from where it was natively being done, whether it be in the US or in Europe, and it moved to Asia. And now it's kind of shifting around, and I think some more automation is changing the possibilities. Now, I should note that there seems to be two main segments of electric bikes in America. There's a large percentage, probably the majority of electric bikes that exist in America are made in China. Many of them are manufactured actually for the Chinese market. Somebody puts their name on it and they import it, and then suddenly they're a bike manufacturer. But I wouldn't really consider them a bike manufacturer. They are a brand, and if they're even a brand at that point, I don't know. But then you have some companies that actually work with that manufacturer and design the bike a little bit, or they make some modifications. But more commonly, it's just a bike that's already manufactured. They have kind of a open mold, if you will, or just an open line, and they allow people to buy it. That's why a lot of times you see several bikes that look very similar. They have different names on them. That's generally what's going on there. So although some companies might claim to actually design and manufacture the bikes themselves, generally not the case. I mean, unless you consider just putting your logo on it, designing a bike, but I wouldn't say that's the case. Now, not to get down on anybody, because I do think that they serve a purpose, and they oftentimes are a lot less expensive than some of the other companies that develop in a bit of a different way, and they design something from scratch, and they design it for a specific user segment, and they work to have higher standards as far as testing, and they have product liability insurance and all these sort of things. So it gets complicated. We'll probably talk about that another time because it can be complicated. And I guess for the most part, you'll generally see that a lot of the products that come like direct to consumer, like websites that sell directly to customers, but they don't have a shop or any sort of traditional, connection to a customer. A lot of times those bikes tend to come from China more commonly. And not that the quality is necessarily lower there. I think there's just more bikes to choose from, and maybe it's easier to kind of break into that market. Now, I don't have intentions of speaking negatively about anybody, their product, or anything like that. I mean, of course, as a retailer, I try to offer the best quality products that I have available to me. Sometimes people are more likely just to focus on like what they know that they can sell, or what's easy to sell, or what meets a particular price point that a customer is asking for, rather than actually focusing on quality. But I guess that's really where it gets back to like the brand and, who's behind that product and what sort of support do you have behind the product. That's a topic for another time. And overall, I hope you guys enjoyed this. And I look forward to seeing a future video. Well, see you soon.